Okay, thank you for that warm welcome. My apologies, this is going to be in English, but I'm sure your English is better than my German, so we'll go from there. So, how is the UK Ambulance Service dealing with its staff shortages? So first thing, I've got no conflicts to declare. The opinions I'm giving today are my own. They're not my employers or of the College of Paramedics in the UK. So currently, if you ask most people in the United Kingdom about the ambulance service, this is what they'll describe. Large queues of ambulances outside emergency departments. I don't know if it's been in the news over here. You're sometimes looking at in excess of 20 ambulances parked outside of an emergency department, unable to clear. Some of them there in excess of 12 hours. In fact, sometimes we've got day shifts handing over to night shifts and vice versa. So real problems with offloading patients at the emergency department. But is this to do with the staff shortage, or is it something else? And I think what we need to do is I'm going to take you on a little journey about the ambulance service in the UK, try to put that into context, and then look at the question at hand. So the history of the UK ambulance service. So in 1948, the National Health Service was set up in the UK. The ambulance service wasn't part of that. It was completely forgotten about. So it wasn't seen as being part of health. Quite often, ambulance services were charities or they were run by the local council. And when people joined the council, they were asked if they wanted to work on the refuse lorries or whether they wanted to work on the ambulances. And you got paid more if you had a first aid certificate. And that continued up until about 1971, when Professor Douglas Chamberlain started to look at some sort of advanced extended training for people who worked in the ambulance service. And it was the first recognized paramedic training in the United Kingdom. In 1974, they decided it really wasn't a good idea that the ambulance service was separate to the rest of the health service, and it was incorporated into the NHS. And at that time, every sort of little town or city had an ambulance service or county. So there was lots of them. And when I joined the ambulance service, I think there was in excess of 48 ambulance services in England alone. Then in 1985, they decided that although they had these little pockets of advanced practice going on, they wanted to have it across England particularly, and into Scotland and Wales. And they developed what was called extended training, which is what we would now call paramedics. In 1995, there was a recognition that, it was a very vocational training. Prior to that, when I did my paramedic training, it was 6 weeks long. It's now, as I'll point out later on, it's now up to 3 years. So the first paramedic degree started in about 1995. And then in 1999 to 2000, paramedics voted and became a profession in their own right. So they became a registered profession. And then the year after that, the College of Paramedics, which I'm the vice president of, was founded as the professional body for paramedics in the United Kingdom. In 2013, we commissioned something called the PEEP report. And the PEEP report was looking into what the educational level of paramedics should be. And it was at that point that that report came out and recognized that you need to have a degree to be a paramedic. So it was a 3-year bachelor's degree. And that came in 2018. So 2018, you had to have a bachelor's degree to become a paramedic. So to join the register as a paramedic, you had to have a bachelor's degree. That also coincided when paramedics were allowed to become independent prescribers. So they were able to prescribe medication. That's not all paramedics, that's those working at a high level, and you have to do further training to be able to do it. So the ambulance services today, obviously there used to be in excess of 48. There's 10 English ones now, and that's the list of them there. And then for Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, they're all state. So they're not in regions, they're run as the whole state. And obviously Ireland, Guernsey, Jersey, etc., they all have their own ambulance services run by their own governments. So the map looks like that now. And as you can see, they're a lot more regionalized. I always think it's interesting, if you look at London, it looks like a tiny ambulance service, but the population is about 4 times the size of the whole of Scotland. So currently in the NHS, there's about 1.2 million staff work for the NHS in the United Kingdom. It's one of the largest employers in the world. Of them, there's 33,219 registered paramedics. We've seen a 50% increase in the last 11 years. So it's increased greatly. We've got about 25,000 support staff, so people who do driving, assist the paramedics in looking after patients or work independently on their own. But the ambulance service only makes up about 5 to 6% of the NHS workforce. So ambulance types, probably very similar to Germany. We've got double-crewed ambulances, which are called DCAs. They're generally made up of a paramedic and then someone working with them who will be a clinical care assistant or some associate practitioner. We also have ambulance technicians as well, so they're non-registered. They generally do about a year's worth of training, and then they have somebody working with them as well. And that makes up the majority of the ambulance that are available. We've also got rapid response units, so paramedics on cars who go out to triage patients, sometimes transport them, and obviously go to generally high acuity. And then you've got specialists and advanced practitioners. And so this is what I'm predominantly, so I'm a manager of advanced practitioners. I'm an advanced practitioner myself. So these are single paramedics or a single nurse on a vehicle going out to see patients, predominantly trying to keep them out of hospital, but for those that specialize in critical care are obviously going out to high acuity work and managing them on scene before handing them over to someone else or going in with the patient themselves. And the last sort of unit that you'll see in any sort of size is what's called the hazardous area response teams. So these are sanctioned by the government. You have to have them. These are basically teams of paramedics who specialize in going to hazardous areas such as fires, terrorist incidents, etc. You have to have them as an ambulance service. So every ambulance service in the UK will have a hazardous area response team. Some have several based across their region. So what is happening? What's happening in the UK? What's happening with the performance in the UK? So these are the figures from NHS England over the last couple of years. But I think what you can see here, so these are what we call C1 response. So C1 response are cardiac arrest, respiratory arrest patients, or peri-arrest patients fitting, etc. The aim, the target is to get to these patients within 7 minutes. And that's that blue dotted line that you can see there. So sort of July 2020, we were pretty much hitting that. That was during COVID. But then it's gradually got worse. And as you can see, some of those patients are waiting up to about 27 minutes in December of last year. Not great, but it doesn't seem to be getting that much worse, but it's definitely not getting better, although we've seen a drop in January. But these are the C2 figures. So the C2s are your myocardial infarctions, stroke patients, major trauma. The target for them is that they should have an ambulance with them within 20 minutes. As you can see, basically from July last year, that's gone up, and at the 90th centile, some of them are waiting 3 hours, 30 minutes for an ambulance. These are the C3 response times. So these are your minor injuries and illnesses, fractures, etc. So the target there is to get them within 2 hours. As you can see, the average was about 4 hours in December, and at the 90th centile, it was heading to about 10 hours. C4, these are the lowest categories. So these are very minor injuries, etc., but still require an ambulance response within 3 hours. So is this due to staff shortages? Why did we see this sudden massive spike in demand? And was it because we didn't have enough people on the ambulances, or was there something else happening? So these are the figures. So these are patients who've been in emergency departments for 12 hours or more in the United Kingdom. And these are a month-by-month comparison for 2018 to 2022. These were done by the Royal College of Emergency Medicine using data from NHS Digital. So the red line, the red ones, are the ones for last year. And what you can see is that there's a greatly increased number of people that were in emergency departments for in excess of 12 hours. So the emergency departments couldn't move these patients on. But what was the effect of this? Was that the Royal College of Emergency Medicine have calculated that there was about 4,500 excess deaths because of it. And there's lots of research and data that the longer you spend in the emergency department before you go to a specialty, the greater the chance of death. And that's what they were able to show from their research. But what's happening? Why are these patients not moving anywhere? So this is a comparison of hospital beds across Europe. I don't know if you can clearly see it, but Germany wins. So Germany has so per 1,000 inhabitants, you have the most number of beds. But if you look right at the bottom, you've got the United Kingdom and Sweden. Now, often, having low numbers of beds to 1,000 population is seen as being a streamlined, highly effective system. But that only works if the rest of the system is working. And what happens is, if you can't move those patients on, then you have what you've seen with these spikes in demand. So in the Q3 report, this is for England alone, the overnight bed occupancy was 92%. So 92% of all beds in the NHS were occupied in Q3. Some trusts, acute trusts of large hospitals, were reporting 100% bed occupancy. So there was not a spare bed, and that's including ICU beds. The optimal bed occupancy in a hospital should be about 85%. So some of them were running at 100 when the optimal is 85. So why is it running so high? Why are these patients not going anywhere? So if we look at social care, so social care in the UK at the moment, the Care Quality Commission has reported that there's a 10.7% vacancy that just haven't been filled. So there's about 1/10 of the population for social care hasn't been filled. There's 1.79 million people work in social care or posts in social care, and that they think between 55 to 165,000 of those posts are just not filled. There's nobody working there. There's 14,000 patients who are waiting to be discharged. So currently you've got hospitals running at 100%, and across the NHS in England, there's 14,000 patients who are in hospital who could be discharged, but there is nowhere for them to go because they can't get the care at home, or the nursing or residential care is not available because there's not enough space. So what about primary care? So current estimate, 6,000 full-time equivalent general practitioners short in England currently. There was 370 million GP appointments or contacts last year. It was up by 18.7 on the 2019 pre-COVID figures. So they're speaking to more patients, but there's less GPs. And then if you look at the ratio as well, so in 2015, there was 52 GPs per 100,000 population. Last year, it was 42. So they're having to manage more patients. And 42% of all GPs in the UK are planning to leave the profession within 5 years, predominantly to retire. And then we've got industrial action. So I don't know if this has been on the news here, but there's 3 ambulance unions in the UK. They've all been taking industrial action, predominantly for cost of living and staff retention issues. So why are the staff unhappy? So it's been estimated that although we've only, we've got 30-odd thousand paramedics, 1,000 of them have left the ambulance service within the last year. But they haven't necessarily left the profession. So this is what's interesting. So they've left the ambulance service, but they're still registered paramedics, so they're somewhere else. And it's quite difficult to work this out, but we think where most of them have gone is into primary care. So because if you're a paramedic, you're a registered professional in your own right, you can move within the health economy. So some of them have decided they don't want to be on an ambulance anymore. They don't like the work-life balance. They don't like what they're doing. So they've gone off to work into primary care. So they've become what's called first contact practitioners, which is where they've done extra training so that they can work in primary care and manage patients there, or advanced practitioners at a higher level, including those that prescribe. In secondary care as well. So there's a shortage of doctors and nurses in the UK. So what started happening is the acute trusts have started getting paramedics and training them to advanced clinical practitioner. So these are nurses, paramedics, pharmacists, physiotherapists who are trained to basically work as middle grade doctors. So they fulfill those roles. So some of them have gone into there. And some of them are doing what's basically medical assessments for benefit claimants. So they assess people for their benefits, which is obviously a much more social way of working because they're not working shifts. Pay is another issue. So currently, if you're a support worker in the ambulance service, you could earn more working for Aldi or Lidl than you can in the ambulance service because of the cost of living increase and pay freezes over the last decade. Mental health is another issue that's been coming up a lot, and it's worse in the ambulance service than it is across the rest of the NHS. So currently there's 1 in 42 ambulance support workers that are off with stress or depression. I haven't got the figures for paramedics, but it's probably pretty similar. One of the reasons that's been given is that, particularly for the paramedics, it's not exactly what they're trained to do, and spending 12 hours standing on a hospital corridor gets quite demoralizing. And when you're doing that shift after shift after shift, it's having the effect that they're just becoming quite demoralized in their role. And this is not just my opinion, this is from the Nuffield Trust. So this is what they've identified as being the problems. So one of them is that pay this year is 4% below inflation. That paramedics now are basically earning the same as what they were in 2010, 2011. That 1 in 10 paramedics wants to leave their job in the next 12 months. And 1 in 4 have said that they were looking for something else. Working experience, so paramedics, they do this thing called the staff survey within the NHS, so all NHS organisations survey their staff, and consistently what comes is that paramedics particularly have a very low satisfaction for their work, and they're often looking to do something else. And that a lot of the frustration comes that they just can't get to their patients quickly. So obviously that 7-minute target, it's constantly being broken, and therefore people feel quite demoralized about that. So is this a problem just in England? Well, there's Wales. I think that's Scotland and Northern Ireland. So this is across the UK. This isn't just an English problem. And is it just the UK? Well, actually it's not. There's Australia, that's New Zealand, and there's Canada. So this is a problem that's been seen around the world, this increase in demand. So what are we seeing? Now, the ambulance service is often, particularly in the NHS, described as being the canary in the cage. So canaries were used in mines to detect carbon monoxide because they were more sensitive than the people down the mines. So what used to happen was the canary died first, and then the miners ran off and they were all right. So what we're seeing is, I often say, you know, the hospitals can be full, but unless you're in the hospital, you don't notice it. But if the ambulance doesn't turn up, people notice it. So what's happening? So the patients are ringing for ambulances, and they get an ambulance. Oh, this is what should be happening. The ambulance takes the patient to hospital and hands over at the hospital. The hospitals hopefully treat the patient, and then they're discharged home or into care homes or residential homes. Or the patient talks to their general practitioner. But what's happening is you've got this backflow. So there isn't the care home places, and there isn't the carers in the community who can manage those patients. Therefore, they're stuck in hospital. They can't go anywhere. So when the ambulances turn up to offload their patients, they can't, because the hospitals are full. So the ambulances are then stuck at the hospital, and then the ambulances can't respond to the patients. And that's why you end up with those big queues outside. Now, the patients, obviously, what an alternative is to go to primary care, where you've got doctors, nurses, paramedics working as well. But the problem is they're under pressure. There isn't enough of them. You can't get through. In the UK, there's a bit of a joke that the phone lines are open for primary care at 8 o'clock in the morning, and then there's this mad rush to get all the appointments, and by 8:30, all the appointments have gone for that day, and they just tell people to ring back the next day. So what happens? Well, they do one thing, but quite often, they end up with an ambulance response because they try to get help from elsewhere, which can't triage their calls properly, and then what happens is they'll use... So in the UK, we've got something called NHS 111, which is a non-emergency medical advice line, so they can ring that. There's also an online version, so you can self-triage online, but unfortunately, it's not that sensitive, so quite often they'll end up with an ambulance as well. So what have we been doing about this? So the first one we've got in here is fit to sit. And the basic, what that is saying is, does your patient need to be on a trolley? Now, I don't know how it is in Germany, in Switzerland, in Australia. However, one of the problems that we have is everyone thinks you get better treatment if you come by ambulance. And they think you get even better treatment if you're on a trolley. So what happens is quite often patients are on trolleys where if they'd been reviewed by a senior clinician would probably not be on a trolley. So fit to sit is about encouraging crews to say, does this patient need to be on a trolley? If they don't, do they need to have their pajamas on? Because one of the other issues you've got, particularly with the elderly, is they get taken to hospital on an ambulance trolley in their 90. Everyone assumes they can't mobilize. Nobody's encouraging them to mobilize. And throughout their hospital stay, they're not encouraging them to mobilize, and their mobility gets worse. So what they're encouraged now is if they can walk, if they can mobilize, get them dressed and take them to hospital if they need to go. Halos. So halos are an interface between the emergency department and the ambulance crews. So at the moment, you've got the ambulance crews, which is one organization, and you've got the hospital, which is another organization. They're trying to hand over, but there's lots of friction and lots of problems. So halos are generally paramedics, sometimes they're nurses as well. And what they do is they try to facilitate that handover in a more timely fashion. Cohorting of patients. This is a bit of a controversial one. So cohorting is where you will have a crew. So you see you have 3 ambulance crews turn up. What happens is 1 or 2 of those will hand over to the crew that's already there. They will then leave and go back out to get more patients. And that single crew who was already there will look after a bunch of patients that have been handed over for their care till they can hand over to the hospital. It's not great. It does work to a point. However, it is a way of trying to facilitate getting ambulances out in a more timely manner. They're also spending about £50 million on ambulance hubs and discharge lounges. So these are to basically facilitate ambulances turning around in discharge lounges. So instead of having patients waiting for ambulances or whatever to take them home, they will, in the emergency department, they'll be in the discharge lounges waiting to be picked up so that you can get more throughput through the emergency department. They've also spent $250 million trying to buy care home beds, which I do find quite interesting because there's a shortage of staff there. And if that wasn't a problem, if there was all those beds available, then they would already be in use. But basically, the government's putting £250 million into trying to get extra care home bed capacity. Virtual wards. So this is something similar to what we did during COVID. So during COVID, we would often manage patients with COVID in the community rather than them going to hospital. So we would go out and see them in the home, take a set of observations, make sure that they're all right. Virtual wards is patients being managed at home, where they are being remotely monitored, so that instead of being in hospital, they're being monitored remotely, and should they deteriorate, they're then brought back to hospital, but it frees up bed capacity. 2-hour urgent care response. This is a new thing that's just launched. So these are for those patients that could probably manage in the community, but previously they've been picked up and taken in. So these are generally elderly patients. They may need some bloods. They may have had a fall. And now what they've got is nurse practitioner teams, particularly in occupational therapists, who will go out and manage these. So they're quite often tasked by the ambulance service or other parts of the NHS to go and see these patients and try and prevent them from ever going to hospital in the first place. And they're quite good and quite successful at what they do, but they're a very new thing and there's no great data on them yet. So I heard in the last presentation about increased number of clinicians dealing with calls. So particularly in England and in most other parts of the UK, the calls are triaged by non-clinicians. So if you ring 999 or if you ring 111, it's generally not a clinician that you will talk to first. It's a call taker who follows an algorithm, which is pretty good at picking up when people are really sick. It's not so good at picking up when people aren't really sick, and it will over-triage. So part of my job in the team that I play a part in managing is we've got nurses, paramedics, doctors, pharmacists, and we will ring these patients back. And we will talk to them and decide if they really need that level of response or if they need something else. So increasing the number, and what we've found is if you get a more senior clinician, they're much better at managing these patients remotely. Increased in GP multidisciplinary working. So general practitioners in the United Kingdom are basically small businesses that are contracted to the NHS. Generally, they were just made up of predominantly doctors with some nurses. However, that is changing. So it started predominantly with pharmacists and physiotherapists. They're now doing something called, where they expand that in something called the R's scheme. So that's now open to paramedics, which is where those first contact practitioners. So to increase the amount of workforce that is in primary care, this is where we're seeing some of the paramedics going. And I know this is about this is an ambulance conference, but this is what happens is you get more educated workforce. They can go and work elsewhere. So this is a problem for an ambulance service, but it is also part of the solution to the wider health economy. It takes about 10 years to train a GP. It takes about 5 years to train a first contact practitioner. So you can get them seeing patients much quicker. The government's also funding 800 new ambulances. But the question there is, where's the staff going to come from? And I always say you can have 100 more ambulances, but it's just 100 more ambulances parked outside the hospital. If you don't fix the rest of the system, then you end up having a problem where they'll just end up queuing. So across England, particularly England, there's 800 new ambulances that are being funded. There's about 6,000 student paramedics going through the system at the moment. Strange enough, paramedics is one of the few courses that's generally always full. So nursing's seen a massive decrease in student nurse applications, but paramedic applications is just getting bigger year on year to the point that they're starting to struggle with placements. And as already mentioned, you've got paramedics who are now 5 years post-registration who are able to become first contact practitioners and able to prescribe theoretically afterwards by doing their prescribing course. And that helps greatly in managing patients because you're not relying on someone else to do your prescription for you. You can do it yourself. They're also increasing the number of 111 call takers, and they're also increasing the number of 999 call takers because the problem is the volume that's coming through is so great that they're not being answered in a timely manner. And what ends up happening as well, so the non-emergency line, which is the 111, if that doesn't get answered, and sometimes those people are waiting half an hour plus to get through, is they ring 999. And what they also sometimes do as well is they will contact their GP, they'll fill out an NHS 111 online form, and they'll contact 111 and just see who gets back to them first. So they just hedge their bets. And thank you. You got any questions?